Dr. Mildred Jefferson. She was born in Pittsburgh, Texas, and she is graduated from Carthage High School. She went on after she left here to be the first black graduate of Harvard Medical School. Woman, pardon me, thank you, of Harvard Medical School. She's a committed Christian. She's the daughter of a Methodist minister and a father and public school teacher mother. You have participated in a number of programs and been on many television shows in the past, including Good Morning America, Nightline, Today, 60 Minutes, the McNeil-Lehrer Hour, Mike Douglas, Sally Jesse Raphael, and the list goes on a good ways. You also were involved in the Twin City premiere of the widely acclaimed seminar series, Whatever Happened to the Human Race, with theologian Dr. Francis Schaeffer and C. Everett Koop, M.D., prior to his appointment as U.S. Surgeon General.
That is correct.
And welcome to Carthage. Welcome
Delighted
home.
to be back.
It's been a long time that you come back once a year, correct? For a
yes,
family
my
reunion?
mother's family, Robert's family in the Walnut Grove community, established a family reunion 3 years ago. So at least I've been able to come back once a year without it just being for a funeral.
I understand. Tell me about your mother. She's from Panola County?
Yes, my mother was born in Panola County and spent all of her most of her teaching career in Texas public schools. Then when she retired from teaching, she moved to Massachusetts, where I had already gone. But in many ways, she was quite ahead of her time, because first of all, my education was always the top priority, and even though she never did in any way go back on what she felt as a responsibility to help her brothers, who at that time were mostly farmers, she still put learning, reading ahead of anything else. If there was a choice between food and books, it would be the books.
As we said, she stressed education. Did she teach locally at any of the public schools?
Oh, yes. Mother taught in, obviously, Walnut Grove community, Holland's Quarter. There was another community whose name I've forgotten, but in Timpson, several places around, although I would think the longest part of her career was in Walnut Grove and the other schools immediately around. Now,
back then, this is before desegregation.
Yeah, the Brown 1954 school desegregation decision.
And it was a far cry from what public schools are today, probably in a lot of ways.
Yes, but you see, the teachers felt a responsibility to try to enrich the curriculum. There was an awareness of what may not be provided through the school system, and Mother certainly always provided the enriching materials for me, and I'm afraid sometimes in the lower grades I knew a little bit more than some of my teachers, but I did not try to let them be aware of that. But I think one of the things that was beneficial to all of the students was the fact that the teachers never ever drew limits for them because of the circumstances of the school.
Assess her impact on you as an individual.
Well, obviously, because she made possible the things that I wanted to do, she would have quite an influence, but I am in many ways equally influenced by my father, because both of them conveyed without any direct word of it that whatever I chose and whatever I decided would be what they would support.
Your father, where was he from?
My father was born in Louisiana, and then his family settled in Texas, and he grew up in a community not really too far from the Walnut Grove community. I think it was called Elysian Fields.
Elysian Fields, it's still there, and growing, in fact. It's a growing community at the moment. And in Panola County, I might add. It's just barely kind of borders Panola County. He was a Methodist minister. Where did he preach locally?
He didn't. Let's see now. I think he may have pastored Miles Chapel. My memory may be wrong about that, but obviously he pastored in Pittsburgh at St. Beulah's CME Church, in which parsonage I was born. That building no longer exists.
You were born in the parsonage?
Yes, in Pittsburgh. But I left there at age 6 months. My father also pastored in other communities in Texas, but in Louisiana, Arkansas, Tennessee, South Carolina, and I don't know what all others. And at one point he was the presiding elder. In fact, some of the people that I met on Friday evening, February 19th in Pittsburgh, indicated that my father had been the presiding elder, and she had met him at her church, which was not St. Beulah's.
Did he work bivocationally?
No, not in the early years. In the early years before he became an Army chaplain, his time was devoted strictly to his pastoral duties. But when he came out of the Army, he had developed quite a hobby and interest in photography, so that when he came out of the Army, he pursued that and developed it for a while into a vocation rather than an avocation.
Did he, you probably have a good many of his photographs, I assume, then?
No, I don't, as a matter of fact. Over the last few years, there have been several disruptions in my activities, so that through having things stored in different warehouses and other things, I have lost really quite a bit of my personal historical collections, as well as some of my business and professional historical collection, so that I perhaps will eventually have to sue lots of people here and there if I don't
recover them.
Yeah, if I don't recover them, and if I've lost them because of someone else's actions.
What a shame. That's a sad thing to hear.
Yeah, it's not. I'm not happy with it at all.
How was discipline administered in your family? Which parent would you say was the most strict, or was there a balance?
My mother was the more strict.
Mm-hmm.
My father, I don't recall ever having chastised or disciplined me about anything, because he trusted my judgment in everything. In fact, when he was in a hospital for diagnostic workup, when he was in his 90s, he was upset one day, and when I arrived, he said, "It's too bad you are not in charge here." So that whatever I did was always all right with my father. But Mother was the one who established the disciplinary guidelines, and she did not spare the rod when I was a child. Of course, I never thought I needed any chastisement or punishment for anything. So that when she did chastise me, I would wait until it had all blown over, and I would suggest to her that it was unnecessary.
You had said that as a couple, well, first off, as a couple, how did your parents complement each other?
Well, my mother was from rural and small town circumstances. My father's origin was small town, but he generally tended to live in cities, and generally his pastorates were in cities. We would visit him, but we did not actually live in those cities. So there was that difference in outlook. My father was one of 2 children. My mother was one of 7. My mother's mother was a teacher. Her father was a Baptist preacher who gave up fishing for men to return to being a fisher of fish. And my father's father was, quote, with the railroad. We never did know exactly what he did with the railroad, but I would guess he may have been a Pullman porter because he traveled extensively. And his mother died when he was quite young, when he and his sister were quite young, so we don't know anything very much about her. But they both were academically oriented and had a regard and respect for learning. And it was not ever even considered that I would not have whatever academic level that I thought I wanted to pursue.
You, although y'all moved around a good bit, you basically your home root area was Walnut Grove.
Yes.
Tell me your memories of Walnut Grove.
Well, you have to remember that I have always lived a life different from that of my environment, so that mine was lived through what I read, so that my actual participation in my environment was somewhat limited. I know I did some of the usual things that children growing up in the country do. I had pets who were pigs and dogs and cats, and knew the animals and played with the cows. And there was a favorite mule, and I remember the great tragedy when the favorite mule died. It was known throughout the community, and people came from far and wide to, first of all, help in his treatment. I don't think there was a veterinarian in the area at that time. And the treatment failed, and he died, and I remember all of the great sadness and lamentation when that mule died. And I explored everywhere. I had little cousins who were stepladder ages from mine. The cousin that was most closely associated was my cousin Fannie Lou Roberts Thompson, who was 1 year younger than I was. And then Uncle Kermit's children. My mother had several brothers, and they had children. So as each child came along, they had to join the pecking order. And the pecking order was established by age, so that I was the leader of the herd, so to speak.
You've already given me a kind of a chronological outline of where your parents moved from, and you moved with them on these moves. You were an only child, correct?
Only child, yes.
So you were kind of the focus and the center of attention of your parents' lives.
Well, yes and no. Obviously, as an only child, your parents have nothing really to distract them from you, but since they both were in public service, they were committed to service to others, so that my father's ministry carried him far and wide, and mother's teaching was only part of what she saw as her community responsibility, because anything that required the teachers to be involved either professionally, collectively, or through the interest in helping others, she was part of. So that although perhaps she might have been happier if I were pinned to her apron strings, I've always been a rather independent turn of mine. And part of my custom was to disappear from parental observation at the earliest point of the day that I could, and to stay out of observation for the longest period of the evening.
That's a wise move for a lot of children. Eventually, you came, after these various moves that your father made in his ministry, you came back and you lived with your grandmothers?
Well, Mother and I lived essentially in the house that my grandparents had lived in, and that
This is when your dad was in the military? Or?
No, this was when he had the different pastorates, because we generally did not live with him from the time I was about 4 or 5 years old. Mother would not have wanted me to move around in school that often, and as her mother's health became frailer, she had rheumatic heart disease, and as her heart disease became more severe, Mother felt it necessary that she be closer to home, so that she did not want to be too far away.
So this is your maternal grandmother?
Yeah. So that's the point at which my living focus was Walnut Grove.
Describe your grandmother, your maternal grandmother. Was she an influence on you?
Not directly, except for her existence. She too was a teacher. And she was, I remember her as being a very small woman, but who stood always upright, very straight back. And she and my mother subscribed to the fashion magazine of their day, which was something called Godey's Lady Book, so they knew all about the latest Paris fashions, and the ladies sewed their fashions from those books. And of course, a mainstay of my childhood were the Wish books, which were Sears Roebuck catalog, and the Montgomery Ward catalog, and then later I actually learned the name of an Auslander, Spiegel catalog.
I thought they called that Monkey Ward, didn't they?
Not that I ever heard.
Okay. You had to live with a relative to go to school in town, is that correct?
No, it wasn't a relative.
Carthage?
It was a friend, Mrs. Clara Hudson, who provided rooms for girls who were going to high school. And Mother was then teaching, it may have been Elysian Fields, but whatever, she had first considered that I might go to school there, but after the school term started, she felt that there was no way that I would be provided any kind of adequate school year, so that I entered Carthage High School, but about 3 or 4 weeks after school had started, and I lived with Mrs. Clara Hudson throughout my whole high school term.
So what was that like? Did Mrs. Hudson have
well, we were responsible
have authority
for
over you, or
well, obviously in a technical sense she did, but in the strictest sense I was on my own, because I considered that the point at which I moved out of direct parental responsibility or direct parental authority, so that I did take responsibility completely for myself, which meant getting my own meals and setting my own schedules.
Did you realize you were a child prodigy? Did you think of yourself as a child prodigy?
I didn't think of myself as a child prodigy, but I knew other people did.
Do you look back and think of yourself now? Do you see yourself now in retrospect as a child prodigy?
Oh yeah, I was, out of my peer group in every way. I knew that.
A.L. Turner was the principal of your high school
Yes.
at the time. I'd like you to give me some memories that you have of him. What kind of man was he?
Well, he was of the old school authoritarian, but I didn't mind that. I've never had any difficulty with authority, and I think I've never had any difficulty with authority because I have never recognized any man's authority. All of my life, I've only recognized the authority of God, because I am brought up, or was brought up, in a circumstance that put courtesy ahead of almost everything. I learned to be polite, and I certainly would never cause any undue discomfort to adults, but I was not afraid of any adults, and I was not afraid to speak what I thought was right, whether they agreed or not. And sometimes it got me in moderate amount of difficulty, even with
Mr. Turner?
Yes, even with Professor Turner.
Was did you ever sit down and have any discussions with him, or did you ever try to bend his ear intellectually?
No, because that is not my temperament. I'm not a talker. I'm not. I consider, in general, the trend today, the tendency today, is to talk about everything and to discuss one's emotions and so on. I've never, ever been that way. And I still am not. I will talk with people who want to talk, but I am not likely ever to initiate the conversation because I have never felt any need for that kind of emotional or psychological exploration. Which may be one reason why I became a surgeon.
Well, that's unusual because you have very strong political views, and we'll touch on that.
I have strong views always, and have always had strong views. In fact, I remember as a child overhearing someone talking with my mother saying, "Where does that little girl get those ideas?"
We'll get back to that in a little bit, but what other teachers in Carthage that you recall made an impact on you?
Oh, by far, the one who made the most impact was Mrs. Freddie Lee Dolly Clinton, who is now Dr. Freda with a spoon. She was an English teacher, music teacher, who, with Mrs. Arice Neely, were responsible for our musical training. She had an influence in that she always tried to provide the things in our high school that we would have gotten in any high school in the United States.
She's still alive?
Yes.
You still keep in touch with her?
Not regularly, but I do. She's in St. Louis, Missouri.
From time to time. Tell me your memories of Q.M. Martin. You were
Superintendent Martin, yes.
He was kind of he was fond of you.
Yes, but he kept very close watch on the schools, and he had quite an interest in the development of all of the students. He was aware of the legal circumstances at the time, but he didn't feel that that should any way hamper the development of the students, and to the extent that he could, he tried to make sure that there was not a difference in the two, a qualitative difference, when he was unable to do very much about the quantitative difference. And it was through him, of course, that the IQ tests were introduced into the school system. And the first time we, as a group, went over to the larger school was the time after the IQ tests were introduced, and the two highest scores were in the smaller school. And I was number 1, and Walter D. McLennan was number 2.
Was in the black school?
Yeah.
Let's see. You graduated as at
Co-valedictorian.
15, co-valedictorian of your class.
Robert Lee Perkins was the other, who is now a dentist in Detroit.
You were only 15. Did you immediately go to college?
Yes.
At Texas?
Texas College,
Texas
Tyler,
College
Texas.
in Tyler. Do you feel that you had to grow up too quickly?
No.
Did you ever feel that way?
No, never.
You were awfully
I would
young.
have been significantly annoyed and handicapped if there had been the effort to hold me back because of my age. And as it turned out, I needed that early start to make up for the interferences I got later.
Well, what do you mean the interferences you had later?
I was the first of the line of women from Harvard Medical School to go into surgery. And at that point, no woman had ever had complete surgical training in Boston. So that meant something of a delay in getting my requirements finished for becoming certified as a specialist in surgery.
When did you know that you wanted to be a doctor, and why?
Well, when I was very small, I used to follow around our family physician, who was Dr. Allen Moore Baker. In fact, it was a long time before I knew his name was Alan Moore, because he was always referred to as Dr. Alamo Baker. But anyway, I used to follow him around, and instead of saying, "Oh, run away, little girl, you're bothering me," he would let me follow him around, and he would answer the questions I asked. And one day I said, when I grew up, I wanted to be a doctor. He said, "Well, now, if you want to do that, you just go right ahead."
And you did?
Yep.
You've said that East Texas roots are the basis for your ideology.
Yes.
Why?
I think because in general, the attitude of the community was one that recognized that education was a very valuable thing, that the individual must take responsibility for his or her own actions and for his or her life, and that people had to themselves make the preparations for their future. But I don't know what the basis is for my view of life and people. I've simply always looked at everybody the same way. Mm-hmm. I don't see the differences in people.
It's interesting to me that you mentioned that, and that because it's something that seems to be a line through Carthage, is that the people have continually, in this community, have continually had a focus on education, and I kind of have a feeling that came from QM Martin in some ways.
It very well may have, because as I recall, all of the people focused on the children who were trying to seek an education, so that many of the store owners would lend money to people who were trying to put their children through school. Mm-hmm. And for those who were able to go ahead, they got to college. But everybody expected to work to help their own way. And those who didn't have an academic orientation certainly learned a trade or some occupation that enabled them to provide for themselves and their future families.
What was your degree in at Texas College?
Bachelor of Arts.
Okay.
With a major in biology, double major in biology and Spanish, minor in English.
And Spanish?
Yes, Spanish.
Why Spanish?
Because I had a professor who was very interesting, and I took it because of that professor.
You like a good teacher?
Yeah.
You still like a good teacher?
Yes.
You went to Boston after graduating from college. Why?
Well, I always felt that Boston was the place where an educated woman should be, and I did not actually have any idea how I might ever turn up there. But
how did you turn up there?
my father had already joined the Army at that time, and we knew that I would go to medical school. It was just a matter of which medical school. So that I decided that I wanted to go to Harvard Medical School, because that was what was recognized as the best medical school that we knew of. I knew of Johns Hopkins, I knew of Yale, but of everything I could read, Harvard Medical School was number one. And my father, who was stationed in Massachusetts while he was in the Army, had asked if that was still what I wanted to do, and he suggested it as well. Although at the time we were discussing it, Harvard Medical School was not accepting women. But I didn't really think of that as a barrier. It was just something I noted as a point of information, but I somehow did not really think of it in relationship to me. Mm-hmm. So that when I got out of Texas College, it was only natural that I would move to Massachusetts because my father had bought a house there.
You were too young to enter medical school.
Well, I would not have been the legal age to get a temporary license to practice medicine as you had to do then at the end of your second year in medical school.
Mm-hmm.
So I actually spent the time getting a Master of Science degree at Tufts University in Massachusetts.
So where did you live while you were at Tufts? Did you live
At
with
the
your
home,
father?
at the home my father had bought.
Uh-huh.
My father had gone off to Korea, and Mother hadn't moved there yet, so I actually lived alone, although we did have a tenant that had rented one apartment in the house.
Were you constantly buried in books, or did you have a social life during this period? I mean, when I say social life, I mean, did you have friends that you go
I
out
always
with
have
and
friends
just,
that I
run
may or
with
may
and-
not go out with, but I have never consistently pursued the kind of social activities that distracted from reading or the things that you do in a solitary way.
Mhm.
I think that obviously is because I am an only child. I don't depend on other people for either entertainment or social support.
Would you consider yourself a loner?
To some degree. But it's only to some degree because I don't have any difficulty meeting people. And I can adapt in social circumstances without feeling any psychological strain from it. But if there is the necessity to make the effort to do so, I'm not likely to.
How hard was, well, first you received your master's degree from Tufts, and then you applied and were accepted to Harvard Medical School. How did you pay for your schooling?
I had a scholarship, which I didn't know anything about, which I was awarded in honor of Charles Drew, Dr. Charles Drew, who made the contribution of that enabled us to establish the blood banking system. And actually my medical school education was paid for by my parents, my mother and my father, with the supplement of it was given initially as a full tuition scholarship, but the tuition increases increased, but the scholarship amount didn't. And I accepted it because I thought this would be a relief of some of the financial burden on my parents, but my father was not happy that I accepted the scholarship.
Why?
Well, he wanted to feel that they did it alone, which they did not have to do because of the
It would have
scholarship.
been difficult because Harvard is expensive and was
Yeah,
even
but he
then.
was an Army chaplain, so he was not in the same position that he would have been as a minister in a small Methodist church.
Immediately after receiving, first, you were the first black woman to ever graduate from Harvard Medical School, as we've mentioned. Did you realize at the time that you were making history? Did that strike you?
Yeah, because everybody kept telling me. But that didn't mean anything in particular to me. I was just sorry that my acceptance and having done so had to be something of note. Someone would have done it eventually, so I'm happy enough that I was the one. But on the other hand, it was too bad that it had taken that long.
Immediately after receiving your medical degree, what did you do?
Internship in surgery at Boston City Hospital. And that's how I came to be the first woman to intern in surgery there.
So, how long did you continue to just practice surgery for?
Well, I went up
years,
the
or-
ladder for a while. The big problem first started when I indicated that I was not going to apply for an internship in internal medicine, radiology, or pediatrics. And when I indicated that I would be seeking a surgical internship, that is when all of the difficulties started.
Well, you mean difficulties?
No, only one or two other women before me had even expressed an interest in surgery at Harvard Medical School, and they were discouraged. So by the time that internship applications were made, then they had been talked out of applying.
Why were they discouraged, do you know?
Yeah, because in general, surgical chiefs then chose the people on their services in their own image, and there weren't any women chiefs.
Okay.
Among other reasons.
Among other reasons. Did the media become interested in you after you graduated? Was it immediate?
The collective media became interested in me from the moment I was accepted at Harvard Medical School, and around that, receiving scholarships from the H.L. Herschel L. Gutman Foundation and I think the Simon Foundation. And both of those organizations had professional PR people, so that the awarding of the scholarships, coming on the heels of the publicity around my acceptance to medical school, generated a media focus that lasted quite a long time, because that meant that almost everything I did was under the glare of media's spotlight.
Was it distracting?
No, I didn't notice it. I mean, things like this were of no consequence to me because they had no particular value. They were things that other people recorded, and once it was clipped out and pasted somewhere, that was the end of it for me.
During your life, you've seen a lot of change in society, obviously. And a lot of this change you have formulated opinions on and become active in. How did you feel about the civil rights movement of the 1960s?
I was never an active participant in the racial civil rights effort, because I will never take a publicly active role in anything in which I have a direct stake or interest. I preferred to make my contribution along those lines in a more private way. You know, the fight to accomplish whatever I could within the limits of my skills and ability. I wanted to be my participation in bringing about harmony of the people in our country. But the direct effort of something that I would have the direct benefit from, I did not participate in.
What are your impressions of Martin Luther King?
I never did meet him, but I can certainly appreciate the approach that he took that many of the people who followed him never did understand. But I did not support that effort because I don't believe the Gandhi nonviolent resistance approach is the right approach in a place where all the people have to stay together. In India, the British Raj eventually had to leave. That is, the British rule eventually had to leave, and that meant everything that it represented could be thrust out. We have to stay together in the United States. And when you provoke someone beyond their capacity to control themselves, you're going to have a serious problem. Here, and it worked in India because you were dealing with the British, who were at least had some kind of conscience that could be appealed to. The same approach against the Nazis would have simply enabled mass annihilation of the people here in the United States. I don't feel that you can heal as easily the deep disruptions that occur when you deliberately force people to act in a way that's going to leave a permanent division. So that I did not support the effort.
The civil rights movement has changed a lot since even then. What are your impressions of it today?
It's difficult for me to form an impression of the civil rights movement today because in many ways I think it is crippling people by giving them the idea that they can only survive if they have someone else guiding their decisions or making their decisions for them. I think there's also a tendency to encourage making excuses instead of analyzing problems and seeing what the individual can do to resolve a problem and to foster civic and political participation, not for the good of some individual, but to enable all of the individuals to participate in building the kind of societies in which they want to live. Much of the mass participation now is not to the benefit of the people, but to individuals who may or may not represent the best interests of the people whose support they're getting.
Although you have not been directly active in the civil rights movement and you weren't involved in the civil rights movement, you do agree, though, with the statement that a man should be judged by the content of his character, correct?
Exactly, and I wish more people who report themselves as followers of Martin Luther King Jr. believed in it more than parroting the words, because on the one hand they say that, yet on the other they cannot do a single thing without some kind of color connotation. They see the world through this colored filter, and they wear a plastic balloon of color, so it doesn't matter what they do, they're inside these bags. And I think it's unfortunate because I've noticed on many of the campuses, especially when they created the programs of outreach and bringing students, for example, from many of the poorer sections of New York City and other places onto campuses, but by the time they locked them into the so-called Black Studies divisions, it really was of no value for them to have come to the university because they stayed in these little bags all of the while. And the only thing they got while they were there was what could seep through the bag. So the total academic experience was never part of their experience, and I think that's a tragedy.
You know Ronald Reagan and George Bush both, correct? Yeah. And what are your impressions of their presidencies?
Well, I think there is no objective analysis of either the Reagan presidency or the Bush presidency by the mass media at this time. I met President Ronald Reagan when he saw a television program I was on in 1972, and he got a videotape of that program from public broadcasting, got my address from public broadcasting, and wrote to me. That's how I happened to meet him in the first place, and that's when he was leaving office as governor of California. So that at the point that we met through his contact, he had no firm plans for any further political career beyond leaving the governor's office. And certainly we had no firm plans at that time of organizing a national political effort. But something brought us together over the airways, so that having known him personally, I know that the impression that has generally been created by an anti-Reagan media not only misrepresents him to the public, but misrepresents how he saw the presidency and people. I've often heard him criticized as not being sensitive to racial matters. Well, if they want sensitivity, they can get someone from the Ku Klux Klan. It's hard to find anyone more sensitive than some of their members. But on the other hand, if you want someone who truly understood fairness and balance and treating everyone alike, then Ronald Reagan fits that bill, because he treated everyone alike, whether you were Margaret Thatcher or me or the housekeeper in the White House or whoever. That's just the way he was. He took people as he found them. And President George Bush is a very committed, dedicated person. He and his wife Barbara have been active participants in civil rights affairs for years before he started running for the presidency. And I think Mrs. Bush has served on the board of, I think, Spelman College for years.
Mm-hmm.
So the kinds of criticisms I heard of them not only were unfair and unjust, but by people who did not bother really to learn anything about the individuals. Time will, I think, more than restore the accomplishments of the Reagan years and the Bush years. And I think if we can withstand some of the damage of the present years between now and 1994, the value of the Reagan-Bush years will be even more appreciated, and I hope that we can prevent the attempt to turn back some of the accomplishments of those years.
You've told me that that America never saw Reaganomics.
Exactly.
What do you mean by that?
Well, you will often hear the criticism, oh, well, the sort of smart alecky expression, trickle-down economics never did help anyone very much. It may have trickled down to the rich, but it never did get farther than that. The full program that Ronald Reagan and his economic advisors had created in order to reduce taxes, in order to encourage investment, in order to encourage economic growth, to create and provide jobs, never was implemented because even though he had a Republican majority in the U.S. Senate to give him some leverage in helping negotiate these things, the House of Representatives is the branch of government that has control of the federal purse. And they never, ever allowed the Reagan Economic Recovery Program to be implemented intact.
Mm-hmm.
By the time a program got through the Congress, it was the congressional version of the Reagan Economic Program.
So in other words, what you're saying is that with a more cooperative Congress, a lot more could have been accomplished.
A lot more could have been accomplished, but the kind of
downsizing the federal
Yes,
bureaucracy,
yes.
for example.
Many of the cabinet secretaries that I knew at that time would indicate how they would approach the suitable committee that they reported to, congressional committee, House committee, and they would be complimented on how sensitively they had created their budgets, keeping the line on spending, reducing unnecessary items and expenditures. And then after being complimented on how well they had done, Congressman X, Y, or Z would then grab a handful of money from over here and drop it in because, we really can't afford that much reduction, or they'd put in another here because, this is in my district, and the people there have grown, that they depend on that, so that would go back in. So that by the time they actually saw the final version of the budget, it would look nothing like what they had presented, and it was back inflated again. I know there is the attempt, especially for some members of the Democratic elected contingent who did not have the balancing the federal budget or federal budget deficit even in their vocabularies before Ronald Reagan was elected, are now trying to say, oh, well, during the Reagan-Bush years, the federal budget got to be the largest it has been throughout the entire history, and now we are a debtor nation. Well, that federal budget deficit, that jump came because of the outlay we had to make to repair the damage done in the Carter years, just to restore our military capability to the equivalent line that it was at the time of Lyndon Johnson, for example, without which I'm sure we would not have the circumstance today where the threat of nuclear war from the major powers is gone. The Soviet Union is gone as a major world threat. And if it were not for these destabilized conditions in the post-Soviet circumstance and the Middle East and Somalia, the world would be almost without war. I'll say almost because it has never been at a point of being completely without war, even at the end of World War II.
Some people, though, think that the destabilization of the Soviet Union is more dangerous in some ways because of the uncertainty of their future than it was when there was a standoff, at least, between the two superpowers.
Yes, but there is less danger to us.
You think that's dangerous to them within?
From a humanitarian standpoint and with our concern for suffering, war, and devastation everywhere, we have a stake, and we also have a concern, and we can get involved to some extent, but there isn't the threat of World War III there. The threat of World War III is still in the Middle East.
Yes.
There's a tendency in our country always to be more concerned about Europe than the Middle East anyway. But if there is a World War III, it will come out of the Middle East and not out of Europe, I believe.
Give me your impressions of what has become to be known as the politically correct movement.
Oh, don't mention it. The left wing, no matter where it is, which is the combination of socialist, Marxist, communist, Leninist, and whatever ists there are on the left side, have no understanding of democracy. They do not care about democracy beyond the fact that it enables them to express their rights and beliefs and gives them the opportunity to interfere with the freedom of expression of other people. And the one thing the leftists do is to get in positions of influence so that they can dictate what other people can and cannot do. And unfortunately, on most of our principal academic campuses, whether they're east, west, north, and not quite so bad in the south, there is the attempt to reshape the society by determining what language is used. And much of the discussion now hinges on diversity, ethnicity, and trying to see that we develop in the United States as a society that respects diversity. Now, all that sounds reasonably good until you examine the application. For our democracy to work, for our democratic republic to work, the premise is that reasonable people will make prudent decisions. And there is very little safeguard when unreasonable people make outrageous demands or simply act in disregard of everyone else. The feminist movement, which is basically in its political orientation socialist, is anti-democratic in the sense that they don't care to use democratic processes. They use the Constitution to the extent that it can be used to advance their ends. But so far as fairness toward everyone and freedom for everyone else, that's non-existence. And part of this change and conditioning of the society is to dictate what the language is. The feminists have gone a long way in establishing what is politically correct by trying to make English language gender neutral. And this is the reason for all of these odd
Instead of being a woman, you're a person of gender.
All of these odd circumlocutions, and instead of being a waiter or a waitress, you're a wait person. And instead of being a chairman, which is to differentiate you from the object that people sit on, their wish is that people be called chair. So that it goes to such extremes that on some of the campuses, if you dare make an utterance which is outside that which they consider politically approved, you just might be booed off the stage or so much noise made that you can't continue your speech. But it goes to the point that they create their own form of censorship of who can and cannot speak on the campuses.
That certainly bleeds through in the media, correct?
Well, in general, those who are the controlling influences in the collective mass media in the United States today represent this as an ideological viewpoint, and they are sufficiently concerned about introducing this to the public that they have abandoned what I've always expected as standards of objective journalism. First of all, reporting the news without fear and without favor, and maintaining an objective standard of fairness and balance.
Mm-hmm. So you don't like to be recognized as a chair, which is an object
No,
to sit
I'm
on.
a chairman
And you
of
don't.
whatever I have been elected chairman of. And chairman does not imply any male delineation.
It
The
implies a
name
position.
yes, it implies that you are a human being and not an inanimate object.
You've also said that you don't want to be referred to as a hyphen American.
No, I'm not. I am an American, period.
Not an African American.
No,
but
even though I have African ancestors, I am not an African American, because I was not an African citizen before I took my U.S. citizenship.
You are
I was born an American. I won't be hyphenated. I simply am not going to accept any of these little boxes. So that for those who are more comfortable doing that, let them do that. But don't try to fit me in them. It reminds me of the trained bear who had the cage around him. And when they took the cage away, he still stayed where he was because he was accustomed to the bars in that location.
Mm-hmm.
I won't sit in the box. So I would think at this point, since I've made this point all my life, that they may, stop trying it. But the difficulty is that different people who have public influence tend to do this. I won't use the color terms either that came out of the radical activity of the 60s. If you're going to black, black, black everything, why shouldn't people white, white, white everything? And if you're going to white, white, white everything, what are you going to do about Native Americans who then may want to red, red, red everything? Or the Asians who are now becoming very numerous in the society who may want to yellow, yellow, yellow everything. But how are you going to go through all of the splits and shades and so on? When you're going to be pale almond here, orange, yellow there, ridiculous. Give it up. It's time to give it up.
In other words, it's time for people to just see each other as people.
Yes, and Americans to see each other as Americans, because this focus on diversity, as they are doing it, is not to bring people together, but to focus on their differences, which keeps them apart. It's a miracle that in our country, we've gone through slavery, through the Civil War, through the riots of the 70s and so on, and there still is relative harmony in spite of the riots in South Central Los Angeles or wherever else. The people still can live together. We don't have a Somalia where all of the people are the same color but were killing each other like flies until we were able to get in and try to hold them apart. Or Northern Ireland where people are all the same color but they are still killing each other over their religions. And in the former Yugoslavia, where underneath the beards, I think most of the people are the same colors, and if they are not of the same colors, they are part of the same racial stock. So it's pointless. We in the United States have got to be the model for the world. We are the ones who are going to have to show that people of different kinds can live in harmony together. And you can be ever so cognizant of your own origins, but you don't have to wear that on your head and batter everybody else with it all the time. And you don't have to try to make the whole society spend the time that you can spend yourself maintaining your culture or your version of it.
You describe yourself as a Christian. Why do you believe that man was made by God?
In his own image and in his own likeness, because he felt that that would be the salvation of the world. Why not?
Do your beliefs conflict with scientific fact?
No.
Why?
There is a space scientist, Jastrow, who made the observation at a commencement of St. John's University in New York, at which we were given honorary degrees. And in that particular exercise, instead of having a single commencement speaker, they let each degree recipient make a 2 or 3 minute speech. And in it, he said, with every pinnacle that science reaches, they find that the theologians have already been there.
Interesting.
It is.
That is interesting. And an extensive study of theology would generally reveal that.
Yes, it would. For example, the Catholic Church has long taught that life begins at conception. That was long before anyone had done studies to identify the egg cells from the woman's ovary or the sperm cell from the male, and how the transmission of the beginning of life takes place. So the scientific proof came much, much later. Now, in Jewish teaching, as I understand from Rabbi Samuel Fox in Massachusetts, it's taught that when a person is killed, 3 bloods are shed. The blood of all of that person's ancestors, that person's blood, and the blood of all of those who would have descended from the person who was slain. Now, when the genetic code was unraveled, and we learned about DNA and RNA as the secret of genetic transmission, that was just verification of what theologians centuries and centuries ago had come up with.
It is correct to say that the most recent DNA evidence, fingerprinting, I think is the term that they use for it, indicates that man did come from one universal mother and is no more than about 300,000 years old. Isn't that correct?
But that same DNA...
But that's not being taught in public school.
That same DNA that she had has come down to all of us. So some people may be prouder because their skins are one color, or prouder because they don't have enough color.
But she was the mother of us all.
Yeah, and even though we are very diverse, unfortunately, or fortunately, as you want to look at it, we are all related, and we are one human family. And there's no way of denying it. You can try to be something else, but as long as you're a Homo sapiens, you are related to every other Homo sapient.
You are vehemently pro-life.
Yep, I am a right-to-life advocate.
Did you see Roe versus Wade coming before it happened?
Oh, yes, we saw it coming with the Griswold decision that was handed down in a Connecticut case.
About what time is this?
I think it was about 2 years prior to Roe versus Wade, which was handed down in 1973, because in the decision, the U.S. Supreme Court referred to the right of a woman to bear or beget a child. And because of that phrasing, we knew that something else was coming down the line.
What was your immediate reaction to Roe versus Wade?
I didn't believe it. I thought someone had misrepresented the information or had mixed it up, getting it over the wires.
You were, as a medical ethicist, you were outraged?
Not outraged, just appalled. That my first reaction was to be stunned and then appalled, because I had spent all of my medical education learning to do no harm, learning not to kill people. And now he was the U.S. Supreme Court giving me almost absolute control over life and death, starting with the unborn child, but not requiring that the state provide protection for that life at any point, so that under Roe versus Wade, since getting rid of that baby on the request of the mother depended strictly on my medical judgment and my willingness to comply, and since the state had been blocked from interfering, and even in that last 3 months when the state could make some regulations, it still could make no regulation which would overrule my judgment as a doctor, so that if I wanted to, I could get rid of that baby right up to the last minute of the last hour of a full-term pregnancy. But Mr. Justice Blackmun, who wrote that majority opinion, when he did provide the opportunity for the state to make laws which could prohibit, or as he said, proscribe abortion, and, not interfering with my medical judgment, of course, but he wrote the words, if it chooses. So if the state chooses not to make the laws that would protect that life, then that would give to my hand, through the full span of life, the ability to end whatever lives were considered a burden or inconvenient. And now you've got this doctor that I consider nothing more than a professional serial killer going around, yes, assisting suicide, as he calls it, and killing people right and left, and saying that he's going to disregard the law.
And he's been given some leeway by the courts, in essence, up until
yes,
new law kicks in, I think, at the end of this month.
Yes, but even then he says he's going to ignore the Michigan law, and that brings me back to the observation I made earlier. The premise of this democratic republic is that reasonable people will make prudent decisions. There's little safeguard for the one who wants to do the outrageous thing and acts in total disregard of all of the laws. But that particular doctor is a pathologist. He has never had really to deal with living people. As a pathologist, his patients were already either dead, or the parts that he got of them had already been separated from the people to which they were attached.
Why was there so little public reaction? It seems like, in my memory, there was surprisingly little public outcry or reaction to Roe versus Wade when it was first
there was
passed.
tremendous outcry and reaction to Roe versus Wade being handed down. It may have been played a different way in your community. And because of the way it was played, it enabled us in organizing a national right-to-life movement to recruit and get membership in a way that never would have been possible had we not had the play on the decisions and had the crowing of the population control, birth control activists who thought the battle was all over. They didn't understand that was only one inning. That was the thing that galvanized the organization of a right-to-life movement, which did not exist as a national effort until 6 months after Roe versus Wade was handed down.
That's when you, 6 months after Roe versus
That's when
Wade,
we organized.
when you first got involved.
No. That's when we first organized the National Right-to-Life Committee. I became involved in 1970 when the American Medical Association had a resolution introduced which did not condone abortion, but sort of bent the AMA's founding position against it, because several states had loosened their abortion laws. And if a doctor did abortion under a state's laws, which was in conflict with the ethical code of the American Medical Association, then they may have been liable to malpractice actions. And it was because of that resolution that had been introduced that Dr. Joseph Stanton and Dr. Barbara Rockett in Massachusetts were trying to get Massachusetts physicians to sign a petition against the resolution. And they happened to invite me to sign the petition. And that resolution eventually passed in that year's House of Delegates vote. But once the resolution was passed, the so-called abortion reform advocates then used the fact of the AMA resolution in trying to persuade others to accept a less rigorous position in upholding what had been the traditional medical ethical position against abortion.
So you have been the president of the National Right to Life movement, correct?
Well, I have been both chairman of the board of directors and president of National Right to Life Committee. during the 3 years of my presidency, 1975 to 78, National Right to Life Committee became an effective national organization, and we moved from the bottom of the religious pages to the front of the New York Times and the Washington Post.
Mm-hmm.
But in the time since then, we had a remarkable period of achievement for a movement that just started in air, because we were motivated and galvanized to action by Roe versus Wade. It took us 7 years to get the White House, get significant offices in the state legislatures and the governor's offices and so on, get significant correction of the makeup of the U.S. Supreme Court. It took the adversaries of the Right to Life movement 12 years to take the White House back, and even then there are some things that they cannot do overnight, because we still have significant influence in legislatures and governor's offices and mayor's offices and so on. But we don't have to start from scratch this time. We have a nationally organized movement that has tremendous capability. It has just grown a little bit fat and flabby in places, and that has to be tightened up. Training has to be tightened up again. But I don't expect us to have to take 7 years to correct the damage of November 3rd.
Tell me about your current anti-abortion activities.
Well, the Right to Life activities that engage my time now are the ones that have done so from the time we started prior to organizing the Right to Life movement. That is, I speak throughout my own state and wherever else in the country that someone wants me to come, not just to civic groups and medical groups, but school groups at all levels. We also, I as an individual physician, am involved with an ad hoc committee of physicians who would like to help achieve a saner AIDS policy for the United States, because we don't have one. We have a public health policy which is not going to control the spread of AIDS, but may very well be responsible for helping to encourage the spread of it. So that that is one thing that I do.
So you're saying an abstinence-based?
Not only an abstinence-based training and educational model for young people and some of the older ones, but universal and mandatory testing. There isn't any way you're going to have an effective public health approach without knowing what the size of the problem is. We've got to find out exactly who is infected and who isn't, and there is even more reason to do so now in case there is proved promise for human beings in the new studies that have indicated with the different combination of 3 of the currently used AIDS drugs that you may have found a way of stopping the virus in its tracks, so that it becomes even more critical that people know as early as possible whether or not they have
because once the physical
HIV
damage
infection.
is done, it can't be reversed.
Maybe not, and you don't want to take that chance. But we also have to go beyond that, and I work with many parents groups across the country who are trying to develop AIDS education programs, not only in the schools but in the communities, which do not violate the privacy and morality constraints that they have. The AIDS Action Committees and others of the Sex Industry Coalition have tried to bring to the public the idea that, oh well, to save a life we have to do everything, but that everything does not include modifying behavior and recognizing that there is a moral component to all decisions and actions. And if you try to disregard that, you're simply going to stagger from one sort of accident to another with innocent people paying the price, or you paying the price with your life. So that there is a continued effort to force these overly explicit sex indoctrination programs in the public airways, on the public posters, in the publicly circulated magazines and newspapers, because this is an approach the AIDS Action Committee and other activists of that kind are comfortable with. Well, we are very uncomfortable with it. And at this point, I have not seen one shred of credible evidence from any source that that kind of overly explicit approach to public education has reduced the spread of AIDS by a single case in the populations that may be considered of less risk.
You've been in the media spotlight, as we said, a good bit. You've been on a number of shows. We've mentioned several of these. Are most of your appearances in the media in relation to abortion work?
No, it all depends. There's a range of concerns in which I may have an opportunity to be interviewed. Obviously, since I am a right to life activist, and in addition to serving with the organizations that we created to be the principal vehicles for right to life activity, I am still head of a national right to life organization. So that I am still, that obliges me to speak on right to life issues. But I also am involved in medical politics, and I expect to take an active role in the discussions regarding how we as a nation are going to deal with our health needs and obligations and our ability to provide the necessary care to all of our people and to help find the best ways of doing that. So that in the past I have had some opportunity to speak on healthcare related issues. And since I also had an activist role within my medical society and medical politics in Massachusetts, there was an opportunity to be heard. But as a Republican political activist, I do from time to time have an opportunity to make a few comments. But in general, there is developed a rather tacky media convention, and that is if you're a female with a brown face, unless you express left-wing democratic ideologies, then it's going to be unlikely that you get to say very much very often. So I think if your memory serves, you may not have seen me very much in the last 2 or 3 years. I think with the concerted effort of trying to restore Democrats in the White House, the collective democratically influenced parts of the mass media have really used every contact and influence that they have to direct attention to one point of view.
So in other words, what you're saying is that you've been, in essence, discriminated against.
Well, not just discriminated against.
Because you are a black conservative woman, and what you're trying, are you trying to tell me that the media thinks that the public will perceive you in a more sympathetic light?
Yes, it's that your adversaries often know a little bit more about you than your friends do. And they know very well that I, as a woman and a doctor and someone who, as a surgeon, is accustomed to persuading people to do things or make decisions that they may not customarily want to make, is going to have an influence if they can reach that public. It's simply going to happen. So not having an effective counter and knowing that most of their arguments and positions cannot stand any direct challenge, they find the easier way is to try to brainwash the public. This is, I know governments impose censorship, but we have unelected governments that impose censorship. And by doing this, I believe that media bias now represents the most damaging form of censorship exercised in our society, so that it is not the government that has made the First Amendment meaningless. It is those who are violating their rights and privileges under the First Amendment, and that is a shame.
Presidents Reagan and Bush have supposedly appointed a conservative, pro-life U.S. Supreme Court over the last 12 years.
Well, that's not so, because neither of those presidents knew at all what the positions of the men and women they appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court had on the question of specifically the right to life. But both men chose justices who they expected to be strict constructionists. That is, finding those men and women to appoint to the court who would try to interpret the Constitution as nearly as possible according to what the framers of the Constitution may have had in mind as applicable to modern times.
Everybody knew where Robert Bork stood on the subject.
He also did not get appointed. He did not get confirmed.
Do you think he was unfairly grilled by the? He was certainly qualified.
It wasn't a matter of being unfairly grilled. It was a matter that he was emotionally and figuratively lynched, and that was the objective of those who undertook to derail his confirmation from the moment that the nomination was made. And every mistake possible was made in handling the Bork nomination. The only criticism I have of Ed Meese was the fact that he made an error of judgment of recommending Justice Scalia before Judge Bork. I think with an election coming up, he felt that the nomination of Justice Scalia would serve President Reagan well in Italian voting communities. He expected that with the academic credentials that Judge Bork had, his nomination would sail through. But he had not looked at everything else around. If he had only submitted the name of Judge Bork at the time we had a Republican majority in the Senate, so that the committee chairmanships were not under Biden, the chairmanship of the Judiciary Committee, it would have been a different story.
He certainly had a very impressive list of credentials.
Yeah, but Judge Bork had voluminous writings, and he had had the effrontery to say that removing a picture of the Ten Commandments from the wall of a school was going too far in misinterpreting separation of church and state doctrine.
Well, we hear about separation of church and state, but aren't we talking about, is it becoming more of a case of separation of church from state?
Well, I think it's a gross misinterpretation of the First Amendment to the Constitution. The First Amendment, as I understand it, and many other legal scholars understand it, protects us in the freedom of practice of our religions. It protects us from our government forcing a religion upon us. But there is nothing in that First Amendment that prevents any religious group or body from looking at what the state does and says you're going too far. But you will notice it's turned just the other way around when those who want to destroy the influence of the Judeo-Christian religions in the society are trying to focus on getting those influences out, because that is the objective for those of the secular humanist persuasion who moved to get prayer out of the schools in the first place. It is to displace the Judeo-Christian influence with their influence. And the Supreme Court itself recognized secular humanism as a religion in a conscientious objector case, so that taking prayer out of the schools is combining church and state if you recognize that the U.S. Supreme Court called secular humanism a religion.
Well, that brought me to my next question. I was about to say, what do you think of humanism? What are your impressions of humanism and its effect on our society as a whole?
The secular humanist view, to get rid of the superstitious view that man arises as an accident of nature and man should be in control of his destiny, the center of all things, freedom of abortion, freedom of suicide, freedom of euthanasia. It sounds good if you are bigger than everyone else, stronger, richer, and you can force your will on everybody else. You can get along quite well. But it doesn't work so well if you are not as big or as powerful or as rich to buy the difference between your weakness and the power. that enables you to exert control. I would still prefer the system on which our laws and customs are based, the Constitution itself with its foundation in this Judeo-Christian moral framework, because the essence of fairness and justice in our laws comes from that Judeo-Christian tradition, so that when there is a conflict between the weak and the strong, and you want to try to make up the balance between the two in this conflict, then just laws are going to join on the side of the weak to make some balance in the conflict with the strong. Mm-hmm. That's not happening with the secular humanist view. That takes us back to that old harsh Roman rule, pater familias, which now perhaps is mater familias, and I deliberately use the grammatical error because now, instead of having the strong controlling patriarch, there's the strong controlling woman who doesn't want to be a mater, so she can never be a matriarch, but she wants to bring the society under heel and dictate and control the society. Now, I would like to throw away that word empowerment for a while, because it is a tragedy that at the first time that women are expected to feel powerful and in control of the society, the sense of that power has to come from the willingness to destroy her nurturing and reproductive capability, and then exercise that power against someone far weaker than she could ever be, the youngest member of our family, the unborn child.
Let me ask you this. If abortion goes unchecked and the right to die movement continues and maybe even has some legislation passed, what do you see as the, what do you think it will mean for American society?
Well, first of all, you can't control a weapon once you place it in someone's hands. We know that from the 1973 to now, with approximately 1.6 million abortions a year, more people have been killed in the abortion chambers than have been killed in all of the wars in which America has fought throughout its entire existence. So that there are segments of the population that are going to disappear earlier. The combination of the two that you mentioned actually constitute national suicide. But there are some groups that are going to disappear faster if the present trend continues. And in the population of women like me, the highest disproportion of abortion is in that population in the ages of 15 to 44, in a group that comprises roughly 12% of the general population. The abortion rate is over 40%. Now, that's a population in which people die unnecessarily from cancer, high blood pressure, heart disease, and stroke, whether it's because they are not diagnosed early enough or whether they resist treatment or even resist going to medical attention, I don't know, but you still have a too high mortality rate in those existing diseases. Add to that deaths from drugs, AIDS, and epidemic homicide among its youth, you have a population which will disappear before the middle of the next century if the present trend remains unchecked. By population, I mean people like me descended from an indigenous population that includes African descent. Mm-hmm. But the jeopardy is to all of mankind, because as goes the United States, so goes the world. And the combination of the two, with the unexpected contribution of AIDS death and the continuing spread of the epidemic, is bringing all of mankind to the brink of extinction.
I you that I think that this all draws back in a way to you worked with Francis Schaeffer and C. Everett Koop,
Yes,
who later became
Surgeon General.
Surgeon General, on Whatever Happened to the Human Race, on a 20-city tour that they did
To introduce it.
promote the book. It's first off, how did you get involved in it?
Got a call from Dr. Schaeffer from Switzerland,
Mm-hmm.
and I was delighted because he could have had anyone in the world to
You were
work with
familiar
him
with
on the
his
project.
writings.
Yes, How Shall We Then Live is something that had generated a great deal of comment.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually didn't know he was writing Whatever Happened to the Human Race, although I had heard one or two people say that they thought he was working on that question next, but I didn't really think anything of it. So the call came from the blue,
Mm-hmm.
and I was delighted with the prospect. And then later we met with Dr. Koop for dinner in Boston and had a chance to discuss it more.
You, Dr. Koop, since he has left the Surgeon General's office, has made some statements that have kind of separated him from what was originally believed to be his stance on some
I
of
think
these
that
issues.
there are many people who read too much in his statements as reflecting their positions, and he did not ever quite reflect their positions to begin with. But unfortunately, as with many very busy people, they often have to start consideration of things at a point that does not give them total understanding of what they are discussing. And Dr. Koop is a committed Christian, but he is working in an avenue where he may be influenced by people whose agendas he has not examined. Because often what they represent as one way is not really quite what the facts are.
Mm-hmm.
And I've seen recently an interview with Dr. Koop on a public broadcasting program, an interview with Adam Smith. And half of the answers showed an incomplete understanding of what they were discussing. And I sat there in agony because the information that needed to be interjected was not there. And I needed to be there to interject that information.
But the book, Whatever Happened to the Human Race, is pretty direct and to the point.
It's direct, clear, to the point, and it is not playing to any gallery. It is simply laying out the information as factually as possible.
Do you think that is more the influence of Schaeffer than Koop?
Well,
If everything that medical sciences has examined has been already examined by theologians.
yeah, the effort is predominantly Dr. Schaeffer's, yes,
Mm-hmm.
but Dr. Koop, the sections that you see were written by him, just as the section of me that you see was written by me.
Mm-hmm.
When Frankie Schaeffer, who did the filming, started it, he indicated to me the amount of time I needed to fill and sat me in a corner at Dr. Koop's home in Philadelphia where we had filmed it.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, write what you have to say.
So, what now? You have been. You plan to do some writing, I understand.
Yes, in fact, I am on sabbatical now. I perhaps should qualify it saying a kind of sabbatical, because my expenses are not the responsibility of Boston University. They are my own. But I've got to get 3 books finished.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I'm trying to do now. And another part answer of the question you asked earlier about my obligation to the Right to Life movement.
Mm-hmm.
And that is to try to help our grassroots get back to the level of organization that they need to be to prevent another November 3rd catastrophe.
So, what are the subjects you're going to be writing on?
One is obviously on the approach I take in the Right to Life battle. The second will have to do with my view of the role of women as we approach the 21st century. And the third is my political manifesto.
Your political manifesto.
Yes.
Wish we've covered some of that in this, but not all, I'm sure.
No.
Is there anything about your political manifesto that you'd like to
Well, I
throw out
want
for
to make sure
food for
the
thought?
Republican Party remains true to its founding. It was the party of Lincoln, the party that freed the slaves, the party of individual initiative, the understanding that individuals work together collectively for the common good. And I do not want what was created to be the party of the people, the only true party of the people, reflective of a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, to be represented as some elitist enclave of a few millionaires, snobbish millionaires around some Wall Street table. Mm-hmm. And I find it so incongruous that the Democratic Party's propaganda machine has been so effective, because if you look at all of those poor Democrats sitting in the Congress, we have a poor man named Kennedy, who is the senior senator from Massachusetts. We have a poor man named Kerry, who is the junior. They're poor because they're not billionaires. One is just a millionaire, and the other is, one is only a multimillionaire, and the other is only a millionaire. And the current administration has more millionaires in the cabinet than either Reagan or Bush. And of course, at his inauguration, he had all of these poor little people from the entertainment world. There's a poor little young man who's had his face mutilated with a lot of plastic surgery, who has too much money for himself to count. Mm. And there was also a singer who I think came from Detroit, who was a millionaire in her own right and has married a Norwegian shipping billionaire. And then, of course, there was this poor little girl from New York, a singer, I think, named Barbara Streisand, who is quite wealthy in her own right and has, I think, just signed a $60 million contract before the inauguration. So the Poor People's Party has left the party of the rich far, far in the shade, and yet people fall for the propaganda that they're always handing out. Mm-hmm. Obviously, the Democratic propaganda apparatus is much more effective than the Republican Party. It has never understood speaking to the heart. They've never understood you'll never get to the head unless you can speak to the heart first. Mm. The problems are those of perception. But obviously the thing that I want to do is help that average reasonable person in the street know that he or she has a responsibility for bringing about the reality of the dream of freedom that our country represents, so that it really will be the place where everyone can achieve that freedom. And so those poor people who are drowning themselves, dying, trying to get in here from Haiti, will find that when they get here. If I wanted to live in a socialist country, I would have moved one. And I certainly don't want the United States backed into the socialist net by the frightening of people with the panic of medical care crisis, health care crisis, so that they grab the socialist solutions and then find themselves suddenly plunging down the precipice to bringing the United States into a socialist net, and especially with a new administration to bring about, quote, change, unquote, and to say we're going to turn this country around. If you turn it around, you'll head it away from democracy to something else, and those only else's are these communist, socialist part of the spectrum. And I do not want our country growing in that direction. But you know, when you are active in movement politics, you have to face the responsibility that you can't always ask other people to go do the leading wedge work. There comes a point when you have to take the responsibility yourself. So people who are active in movements eventually get propelled into seeking elective office. It's an obligation. If you've asked other people to do that, and we have worked throughout the last 20 years getting men and women into office, including putting a president in the White House, Ronald Reagan, and then George Bush, you have to take the slings and arrows yourself. So chances are I will be in the political arena as an active candidate in 1994.
Well, in what capacity?
For the position of United States Senator. That's the next thing I have to accomplish for the profession of medicine, because defending the free enterprise system of medicine is the first step to maintaining the free enterprise capitalist system that is the foundation of our democratic republic.
So you will be running against Ted Kennedy?
That is my hope as the Republican nominee.
Would you propose a problem to him from a political standpoint because you are a black conservative woman who graduated from Harvard, first female to graduate from Harvard Medical School? You kind of defy description, to say the least.
Well, one of the defeated former congressmen from Michigan once said, after I had visited him with some of his Michigan constituents, that if I did not exist, the Right to Life movement would have had to invent me. So I heard the same comment made by one of our Republican consultants, who said that if I did not exist, the party would have had to invent me. But in a sense, I obviously do present a problem, because he has represented himself as the champion of minorities and women. And I find that he is the strange champion, and he certainly is never a champion that I would have chosen.
Mm-hmm. Well, the Kennedys are a powerful lot, or have been a powerful lot.
Of course.
But Senator Kennedy has had his share of personal problems.
He has indeed, and not a candidate who has faced him has dared even approach any of them, including the fact that he uses his Catholic identification for every benefit it can bring him, and then does exactly the opposite of what the Catholic Church teaches.
Mm-hmm. So, how do you think your chances? Is it a case of David and Goliath?
Yes, it is. In fact, over 10 years ago, a political cartoonist drew a little David and Goliath with me as David and the senator as Goliath. I'll have to dig that out and blow it up and make some copies. But my problem will be winning the Republican primary. And the problem so far has been the intramural battles, to the point that I eventually had to sue our outgone Republican Party chairman in federal court to undo some of the things that the state committee had enabled him to do, which let him take almost monolithic control of the state party and the convention apparatus. And that enabled him to function as a czar in determining who would and could not run. Mm-hmm. For those who wanted to spend the money to buy their way beyond it, they could have, but I didn't want to. I wanted to remove the obstruction so that my action is still in the courts, but the subsequent party chairmen have gone a long way to correct the things that I was complaining about, so only one item still remains to be adjudicated.
Despite your accomplishments in your lifetime, you've spent a lot of your time teaching.
Yeah.
And therefore, as a teacher, you have not become a millionaire?
No, but if I had spent the time that I have spent in movement activity and pursuing a fortune, I very well could have been, because that same amount of time in almost anything else would have yielded a fortune. Mm-hmm. That same kind of time and concentration.
Well, but doesn't that propose a problem in running against a powerful family like the Kennedys?
It depends on how it's done.
Or a man like Ted Kennedy.
Yeah, I've been campaigning through the entire United States for quite a long time. Mm-hmm. I should be able to run a U.S. Senate campaign as a mini presidential campaign. And I expect my home state to have as much in the foundation of my political effort as my adopted state, because I expect to have friends of Dr. Jefferson in Texas and every other state in the Union, and 2 of the 3 principal territories, Guam and the Virgin Islands. I'm not sure I can expect too much support from Puerto Rico, but Guam and the Virgin Islands I certainly do expect some from.
Well, David used a rock and asked his brothers why all the Israelites were afraid to slay these uncircumcised Philistines, as I recall. And so we certainly wish you luck in slaying what your perception of uncircumcised Philistines may be.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jefferson, for your time, and welcome home to Carthage, and good luck.
Thank you
in the
very,
future.
very much.
It's been my pleasure.
Bye.